Sorry for making you all wait a little bit more than 2 minutes. I have just one very brief thing off the top, and then I'm happy to dive right into your questions. So the Secretary will be wheels up a little later this afternoon, heading to Israel and other countries in the Middle East. In Israel, the Secretary will reaffirm the United States ironclad commitment to Israel's security and emphasize advancing enduring peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Throughout the region, Secretary Blinken will discuss the importance of bringing the war in Gaza to an end, securing the release of all hostages, and alleviating the suffering of the Palestinian people. He will continue discussions with counterparts on post-conflict period planning and emphasize the need to chart a new path forward that enables Palestinians to rebuild their lives and realize their aspirations free from Hamas's tyranny. The Secretary will also underscore that additional food, medicine, and other urgently needed humanitarian aid must be delivered to civilians in Gaza. He will also discuss the need to reach a diplomatic resolution in the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah that fully implements UN Security Council Resolution 1701 and allows civilians on both sides of the blue line to return to their homes. And lastly, he will reaffirm the U.S. commitment to work with partners across the region to de-escalate tensions and providing lasting stability.
Simon and Said's questions.
Yeah.
So last week, the U.S. sent that letter urging Israel to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza and heed international law. In that time, the Israeli military has targeted a child and then bombed him and the people trying to help him. Band-Aid organizations repeatedly bombed a refugee camp, attacked the remaining hospitals in northern Gaza, killed 4 engineers fixing water systems, rounded up people, tied them, blindfolded them, bombed an UNRWA shelter, and killed a 59-year-old woman as she harvested olives on her land in the West Bank. What does it mean if the Israeli government responds to U.S. requests to follow international law by committing possible violations of international law?
So first, Prem, I just want to be very clear that as it relates to the specifics of some of these operations, I will let the government of Israel and the IDF speak to that. The point of the letter also was to provide a timeline in which we wanted to see certain factors as it relates to the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza and addressing humanitarian concerns addressed. The timeline for that we are not at the end of that process, and so I am certainly not going to speculate or draw conclusions or assessments on that when we are still within that time frame. What I can say unequivocally is that we want to see the humanitarian situation in Gaza addressed. We, as Matt spoke about last week, we saw a couple of benchmarks move forward, specifically the opening of some crossings. That is, of course, a positive step in the right direction. Not at all conclusive, and certainly not at all satisfactory to a lot of the things that we laid out in the letter. There was also a couple of other things that we wanted to see, particularly as it relates to how evacuations are undertook and a couple of other efforts. That work certainly still remains, and certainly there is still a lot of work that needs to be done as it relates to addressing the humanitarian situation. And I expect these are some of the specific things I expect the Secretary to raise. And on top of that, we have been unequivocal that as these operations are conducted, that every possible effort needs to be taken to minimize impacts on civilians and civilian infrastructure. And if you'll just allow me to address your last point about the woman who is harvesting olives in the West Bank, these reports are incredibly concerning. We understand that the IDF has taken some additional initial steps, that the officer was suspended. The IDF has released a statement that an investigation has been opened by the military police. The commander has been suspended from her position until this investigation concludes. And our expectation is that Israel investigate this thoroughly, swiftly, transparently, and it seeks accountability in this incident as well. And I will just note that it is not lost on us that the annual olive harvest is major economic activity to Palestinian people and to the Palestinian economy, and we believe that Palestinians need to have access to their land to conduct these kinds of harvests when appropriate.
And after the killing of Aishnor Egi about a month and a half, 2 months ago, the department mentioned how, this shows that it seems that the Israeli military needs to really consider and reconsider its rules of engagement. What does it say that not only, I mean, I know you mentioned that there's been accountability for the soldier allegedly who killed the 59-year-old woman, but there's that case, there's specifically this case of a child being targeted, and as he calls for help, as people descend upon him to help him, they get bombed. I know you said you won't comment on all of these operations, but is that an operation? That just sounds like a killing.
I'm not going to, again, speak to these incidents in specificity, but I can say, Prem, that what we have said before, it continues to be the case, and it continues to be that we want to see some changes when it comes to military engagement and the rules of engagement, particularly as it relates to the West Bank. That continues to be something that we want to see.
Okay, and then finally, just a finer point. The department last week said the reason the U.S. gave Israel 30 days to improve the situation in Gaza was to give them enough time to cure the problem. You just said that this letter was also about affirming existing U.S. policy. So what exactly happens if the Israeli government doesn't heed U.S. policy? 23 days from now, if these bombings continue, these capturings, these killings continue, as they have for the past 380 days, what specifically will the U.S. do?
So I'm not gonna speculate on what may or may not happen, Prem. I can say, and you heard Matt say this last week as well, we of course will appropriately enforce what U.S. law is. We are bound by the laws that govern our government and of course govern the security relationships that we have with any particular country. I'm not gonna speculate what that process is. There is still quite some time before we're at that point. We hope that we hope that we don't have to get there. Our hope is that we see some effective remediation in efforts surrounding humanitarian access and humanitarian aid, and we hope that we don't have to get to that point. So I will continue to let that process play out. I know that this is something that is important to the Secretary, and he'll be raising it with counterparts on this trip. Go ahead.
There's new reporting that the State Department is investigating an IDF unit for alleged sexual assault of Palestinian detainees. Is that true? And if so, what additional detail can you provide on that? And then separately, just wanted to ask if the State Department is still facilitating flights out of Lebanon.
So on your first question, Nick, I just wouldn't speak to deliberative processes in detail. What I can say is that in any country where we have a security relationship, we of course have processes in place to assess and look at things when certain facts are raised or facts are brought to the United States. In all these places, it's our obligations to do so. But what I can say is that I have no news to share or anything to announce in the context of any sort of policy designation with respect to Israel. And as I said, we wouldn't speak to deliberative and ongoing processes. Leon.
Yeah, I understand. The Secretary feels important to continue to engage in the region, as you were saying. What do you think his leverage, or the U.S. in general, his leverage, is 2 weeks ahead of the elections, going back to the region? Are his hands tied? Is he going to be listened to? Can anything happen?
Leon, I kind of respectfully disagree with the premise of the question, and I'm going to evoke what many of you have heard Secretary Blinken say pretty regularly, is that, in this department and in his role as Secretary of State, and I would say that extends to all of us that work for him, we don't do or engage in politics. We are engaged in policy, and what I can say unequivocally is that pursuing a ceasefire as it relates to Gaza, pursuing a ceasefire in Gaza is in the interest of course, the Palestinian people, because it will allow an additional influx of humanitarian aid, create the conditions, hopefully, for further conversations to happen so that we can see a independent Palestinian state and a Gaza Strip that is no longer a springboard for terrorism on the Israeli people, and a Gaza Strip that is hopefully unified with the West Bank as an independent state. It is in the interest of the Israeli people, because, again, for far too many years, they have been living under the threat of terrorism and proxy groups and malign actors in the region. It is, of course, in the interest of the United States, and it's in the interest of American citizens. First, the Middle East region is a region in which there are a number of American citizens who live there and call it home. But beyond that, the United States, the American people, it is in their interest to see a region pull itself out of these endless cycles of violence that we have seen for far too many years, that date back back further than October 7th. So it's not about leverage, Leon. It is what do we want to see that is the best thing that can happen for the region, that is in the interest of the American people. And pursuing a ceasefire in Gaza, continuing to have conversations with counterparts of what a post-conflict period can look like. All of these things are in the United States' interest, and all of these things are in the interest of the American people. And that is true, irregardless of whatever may come when it comes to our elections.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that, but just to move on very quickly, Lebanon, do you condone strikes against the financial institutions that struck the affiliates to Hezbollah? And there's now considerable damage in southern Beirut.
So
Is it going to become another Gaza?
look, Leon, we've been pretty clear and consistent about the fact that we do not want to see regular and daily strikes into Beirut. As it relates to these specific financial institutions that you're asking about, Leon, I've seen those reports, and I'd let the IDF speak to its current operations. I, from up here, could not offer any analysis on what kind of role they may or may not have had as it relates to Hezbollah's broader infrastructure, whether it be financial or otherwise. I'm not saying that they did or didn't. I'm just saying I can't offer that assessment from up here. Broadly, though, our call continues to be the same, that Israel needs to do everything it can to not target civilian infrastructure and abide by international humanitarian law. And in all of its operations, needs to take every possible measure to minimize impacts on civilians and civilian infrastructure. This is something that Secretary Blinken has raised consistently with engagements that he's had with counterparts, but it's also something that President Biden raised with the Prime Minister earlier in the year as well.
You mentioned the humanitarian situation. Seems like things have only got worse in northern Gaza. You had this 30-day ultimatum that you've given to the Israelis. I wonder if you could give us an update on have they made any progress towards what was laid out in the letter?
So as we talked about last week, we have seen some progress on some of these things. As we saw last week the reopening of the route from Jordan. We also saw the Erez crossing in the north reopen, talking about some of the efforts that we saw last week. Look, certainly nobody in the U.S. government is going to stand in front of you and say that we are satisfied or find the humanitarian situation in any part of Gaza satisfactory. And these are one of the things that we expect the Secretary to raise directly and discuss, not just with partners in Israel, but other counterpart countries, on what more can be done to get humanitarian aid into Gaza. A number of border crossings, to answer your question specifically, Simon, are open. We are seeing truckloads enter the Gaza Strip, and we'll continue to press for more. Absolutely more is needed. More food, more water, more humanitarian aid overall.